and good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sophie from Coproduce Care, and we have put together a set of speakers for this workshop just to go through the cost of care, the fair cost of care exercise that we're all being asked to do as providers. I've got two hats. So one of them is working to try and promote social care in a positive light in Coproduce Care, but also as a provider of a care organisation. So I just found it really interesting going to one of the workshops that the Care Cubed organisation was holding around the fair cost of care. I wanted to find out a bit more about it, so I thought it would be useful to just hold this event to hear from some speakers, but also to have a space where we could have a bit of discussion. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll just explain some of our aims for today. So, and also just to let you know, you probably know this from Zoom, but if you want to change your view, you can do that at the top right-hand corner, and you can change to speaker or gallery, whichever you prefer. So first thing we want to do is get an understanding of the fair cost of care exercise, and just let people know a little bit more what it is. I think people have already had comms centrally, so they should know, but really lucky to have Richard Ayres with us from Care England to give us a bit of a rundown. Then we are going to get some insights from Guy Armitage-Norton, who is a partner at the accountancy firm Milsted-Langdon. And I really do encourage everyone to have your questions ready, put them in the chat, and he's there to give you some of his advice really on this call freely from an accounting perspective of how best to represent your costs. Then some reflections from Alban, who has done various reports on the cost of care as part of Care and Support West, Care Association in the West here, but also he has his own views being involved in social care on what it means and how best to represent our costs. And then there'll be some time at the end for discussions as well between us, because I think that's always fruitful to see some of the best practice that people have been doing in the area. So just a little bit, excuse me, a little bit of a rundown again of our speakers on the next slide, which I might return to a bit later, so you'll hear from them shortly. And then on the next slide, I just want to go through a bit from Coproduce Care. So the whole aims really of what we do as a non-profit organisation is to try and represent social care in a as best light as we can. A lot of people don't really understand it, more do now than they did 3 years ago, but we really want to, we've interviewed a lot of people on our YouTube channel. So if you do subscribe, you'll be able to pick up on all the interviews you've seen listed there. And we also do bits of work outside of that with organisations such as the Health Foundation and Skills for Care. And you can read about all of that on our website. And really, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes going over some of the policy behind the fair cost of care. So on the next slide, I'm just going to discuss where it comes from. So many people will know, obviously, from in December 2021, there was the white paper from the government on reforming adult social care. And in chapter 7 of that, there was a section saying that they did want to find out more about the fair cost of care, as they're calling it. And the aims were to support a sustainable care market where care and support providers are paid a fair rate of care. So I think that's where we're coming from with this, is to make sure that we're representing the fair cost of care as best as possible, and also being wary of the restrictions that may be put on the way that the design of the cost of care spreadsheet or tool has been developed, and how that might prevent that in any way. So on the next slide, I just wanted to pick out, I will read it. I don't like people reading slides, but I will read it out, just on the definitions from the government's or the department's point of view. So the cost of care has been defined as the cost of care that best describes the adult costs a care provider incurs in delivering care at the point in time that the exercise is undertaken. It is typically presented as a unit cost for an hour of domiciliary care or a bed per week in a care home. And the cost of care exercise has been described as a process of engagement between local authorities, commissioners and providers, data collection and analysis by means of which local authorities and care providers can arrive at a shared understanding, so that's important, of the local cost of providing care. The cost of care exercise will help local authorities identify the lower quartile, median and upper quartile costs in the local area for a series of care categories. One of the things that I've often questioned is what is the meaning of fair? So on the next slide, they've provided this in their guidance, and this is all online, updated or published in March. So, again, talking about the median actual operating costs, and this will include and evidence values for return on capital and return on operations, and also travel time for domiciliary care. And I'm going to whiz through to the penultimate paragraph here. For providers, this means they will be able to cover the cost of care delivery and be able to make a reasonable profit. So surplus or meet their charitable objectives. Obviously, we're all coming from different types of organisations. And then from the local authorities' perspective, it recognises the responsibility they have in stewarding public money, including securing best value for the taxpayer. So that's some of the definitions. And just lastly, really on this, for the next slide, some information on timescales. So we're all being asked to return information by a certain time, and that's because local authorities have to report back to the Department of Health and Social Care by the 14th of October this year. And in terms of the organisations they're looking at, the categories are for care homes that provide support for 65 plus, and also for domiciliary care for adults 18 plus. So I've pulled this from the guidance. There's much more information in there. And yes, I've seen in the chat, we will provide, I'm happy to share my slides. I haven't checked with the speakers, but I can always check with them later. And just for the next slide, please, the last one for me. So the fee gap. So they also are being asked to do a market sustainability exercise alongside this fair cost of care, which you'll hear about potentially in some of the comms, and why it's so important to get this fair cost of care exercise right is because they will be asked to report back on the gap between the fee and the actual cost of care. So this is why we really are bringing this to people, so we can have a proper provider-led discussion around some of the issues that we may have in providing that fair or actual, as I like to put it, cost of care. And I suppose from what we think is quite important is to think about not just what you are providing, but what you really need to provide in terms of, pay and everything else to sustain your organization, bearing in mind from all of this information that I've just read out, it's running alongside the actual report on sustainability that they want local authorities to provide. So there is, I think we are going to discuss this a bit later, there is always a little bit of a challenge between what you are actually paying, but what actually you think you need to pay staff, or what you actually need to say is the cost of care based on the ability of your organisation to carry on providing care going forward. And I think Mick is going to take us through some thoughts, and also Guy as well, around what the considerations may be with that. So that's enough from me. I have gone slightly over time on that. I'm very sorry, but hopefully we can pick it up. And we're going to move straight on to our first speaker on the next slide. I think we can introduce them. So this is Richard, who's agreed to talk with us and representing Care England, and to talk through the fair cost of care exercise. So Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us. And again, everyone, please do, as your thoughts come into your mind, just tap them away in the chat and keep that going. So we'll put down the slides and we'll hand over to Richard.
Wonderful. And Sophie, thank you very much. Can I just ask, is it just care homes, or have we got care homes and home care on the call today?
That's a really good question. I didn't look at people who are subscribed to this and find out where they're coming from. I'm guessing it's a variety, but really super helpful if people can just jot in the chat to give Richard a bit of a steer on what he needs to concentrate on. So it's a lot of care homes coming up, but some dom care as well, and some both.
We've got some dom care, so I'm just going to quickly drop another link into the chat as well for the dom care. And can I just ask one more question? Which authorities are we talking about here? Is it multiple authorities, or is it one or two in particular?
I would say multiple, just because I know a lot of providers do deal with multiple, especially in the area we're in. So if you work on that basis.
Wonderful. And am I able to share my screen?
You should be able to. If you're having trouble, then Tobias can give you access. Oh, there we are.
Okay, I shall drag you away, and I will just populate over here. Oops, wrong screen. Yeah, so I'm Richard Ayres. I am a social care advisor for Care England, but I'm also working on behalf of the Care Provider Alliance. So my role at the moment is supporting the Care Provider Alliance, because the DHSC has asked the Care Provider Alliance to support engagement of providers in this exercise. So as Sophie said, this is a once in a generation opportunity to provide some really important data to local government, so they can repackage, apply sustainability principles to, and then report to the Department of Health and Social Care as to what the costs of care actually are within the relevant local authorities. Now, a lot of you will have engaged in exercises in the past. Now, just to say, I can't see the chat, so if anything comes up in the chat you want me to ask, Sophie, please speak up.
Okay.
Lots of cost of care exercises have been done in the past, but this is very different to those cost of care exercises. It's not the same, it's very different, and this is a chance to have your say. We need to collect data from a very wide, diverse pool of providers, because it is the median of those providers that will make up the cost of care, the fair cost of care, that the relevant local authorities will report to as their median, and which they need to move towards over the next couple of years. Now, I think one of the most important pieces of regulation and reform that we've seen is 18.3, Section 18.3 of the Care Act, which is where self-funders sitting over here, much higher rates to local authority funded residents, will be able to exercise their right to be brokered via the local authority. So what we will see is maybe, fees that are in the £1,000, £1,500 mark suddenly coming down to what a local authority rate would be. Now, the local authority is aiming to look at this exercise to define what a fair cost of care rate is, and that will be somewhere between the local authority's rate and the self-funder rate. So self-funders going forward will generally be placed around this fair cost of care rate. Local authority residents will move towards the fair cost of care rate over the next couple of years. The issue that does create is that the self-funder cross-subsidy that usually tops up these local authority funded residents is going to potentially disappear by those that exercise their right to be brokered. It won't disappear completely, because there still will be a self-funder market, but nobody knows how much that will be until we've tested this reform. But the concern I have at the moment is that the local authority residents moving towards the cost of care may create a deficit to some providers. So it's very, very important that you participate in this exercise, provide the information requested, so that the Department of Health and Social Care know exactly how much money they need to inject in over the next few years to make this viable. So I think Sophie called out what was in scope, but I just think it's really important to call out what's out of scope as well. So, the local authority contracted domiciliary care agencies for 18 plus, care homes for over 65 are all in scope, but the exercises should not include rapid response provision, short-term reablement support, local authority in-house care, living care, shifts or blocks of care, sitting services and extra care. There is a note about extra care. The extra care is in scope for funding, but there is no requirement for this exercise to be completed. Now, we do recognise that some local authorities are collecting data from all social care facets, in addition to just over 65 and domiciliary care 18 plus. But I'm only going to talk to you today about the over 65 and the domiciliary care. So very quickly, I'm just going to show you on the LGA website, and I've dropped this link into the chat. You'll see there is some guidance here, and there's a download tool for you. So this is the cost of care tool for, I'm just opening up now, for home care. I'm going to do a very, very quick tour through this because I don't want to take too long, because I'd rather open up for questions. Sorry, I'm just have to ignore these bits. It's my computer playing silly devils. So this is the fair cost of care tool for home care, and it's very easy to complete. It's slightly different to the care home structure. It's an Excel-based tool. It was developed by ADAS and the LGA with the support, developed by ARC and with the support of various providers in its development. But what it will do, it will provide you lots of little helpful nuggets. So if you land on a couple of cells, it will give you some helpful information about what each cell consists of. And there's lots of helpful notes. I'm just making it a bit bigger so you can all see it. There's lots of helpful notes about what is required in each of the boxes. So for home care, you will be breaking down what your visit types are. You'll put your visit length and the number of visits per week. This will total up along the bottom. There's plenty of guidance here to identify how you do that. It will also ask you for your travel time. It tells you how you average your travel time in minutes per visit and in miles. You'll populate your travel time and your distance, and then your rate that you pay for mileage, and again, give you another calculation. Likewise, for some of your other volume data, so average annual number of service users, so putting in the number of service users you have per week, which will equate to per annum and per month. It will give you various running totals, things like your PPE. You may not have cost for your PPE because some authorities are still providing free PPE, but it's really important that you put down the amount of PPE you're actually using, because your local authority can then potentially drop in the rates, even if you don't know them yourselves. So at least they know what the cost is going to be if they decide to stop providing free PPE. You put on the percentage of calls that you make as well, but just the key PPE items. Then there's some information about your basic pay. So you'll populate here your average rates for carers, senior carers, registered nurses, any shift enhancements. And there's lots of notes here to help you understand exactly what you're going to be populating. And again, we'll give you some running totals. And then it will talk about your percentage of time for holiday pay, sick pay, suspension, maternity, etc., that you'll slot in here. Coming down a little bit further, you will have information for your registered manager, team leaders, supervisors, etc., administrators, popping in their hourly rate. So it would be something like £15 an hour. Sorry, one of those, and it's £15 an hour. I think we'll then total up what the annual salary was. If you thought your manager's salary was about £40,000, you can play around with this rate and maybe say something like £19 until it gets to the number that you actually wanted to get to. Okay. There's some various other bits of information here of how you cost out your back office costs, your non-pay overhead costs, things like if you're in London, congestion charging, parking permits, vehicle leases, and then your premises costs, recruitment, training, telephony, uniforms, etc., and any other central overhead costs that you need to put in. So putting those in, we'll just literally add them up here and total them down at the bottom. Let's just give you the running. I'm not filled the data in, so it's not going to put the totals in here, but had I populated this as we go, it will start to populate up. What it then does is gives you the ability, so this is for the, this data here is for the period 21-22. So it will ask you to populate data information from that period. And over here, what you can say, well, we know that there's been various changes, so we know staff pay has gone up. So if you take the hourly rate for pay, again, I haven't put the data in, so I can't change it. You can move the slider to say exactly what the current rate of pay is, depending on how you want to do that. You can make adjustments all the way through the document. So that will help you say, well, actually, the period of data we provided, 21 to 22, wasn't represented because utilities went through the roof. We had the national living wage increase. We've had CPI inflation. We changed our mileage rate from 20p to 25p. And again, you can just make those changes there. And what that will do on the output tab is give you a running total of the cost of care over here, which will generate an hourly cost for home care. So you'll see the formulas, you'll see the calculations that you made based on how you've adjusted those sliders. So that's how the care home model works. It's an Excel-based template, plenty of support information provided within the model itself. So I'm going to move very quickly now onto the care home model, The care home model is on the link that I attached within the chat itself. So if you log into the model, my internet connection is quite good today, so it's nice and speedy. This is set up already for a dummy provider with dummy local authorities, so please ignore the data that's in there. But it will tell you this is a group of providers that have got 23 care homes. If you're a single provider, when you register for the system, you register with your CQC ID number, and the link I sent you in the chat will give you a route of how you can find that from the CQC website if you don't know it. But it's not your care home CQC, it's your registered provider CQC ID. Once you populate that into the tool, it will populate all of the homes that are under your group or your home if you're only one care home, and they'll feature here in the list. Now, the beauty of this tool is it captures out of area placements, which is quite important when you're working across multiple authorities or if you're on a border. I'm going to just quickly, very quickly go into one that hasn't been started. So in fact, I won't go into one that's been in draft format, sorry, so we can actually see one. So if you've got multiple care homes, you can select your care homes, both of them, and then you can download a template. That will create an Excel template down here, and you can choose to populate the information in Excel if you choose. Alternatively, if you're just one care home, you may choose to populate it in the tool itself. So if you click on your care home, this is your CQC care home ID. Sorry, so location ID, that's the care home ID, and this would be your provider ID. What will be automatically populated is your CQC registered capacity. If it's not populated, you can populate that yourself, but it's what you're registered for as a business. We'll show you how that differs later on. You've got 7 headings across the top to complete. The first one is the information tab. It'll just ask you whether you are a care home with residential, nursing, or both. It'll ask if you have a PFI, if you're a PFI contract, because you'll have a slightly different costing structure, and whether you're providing care to residents who are primarily over the age of 65. It will ask you if you were closed during admissions and give you the ability to tell, gives a little bit of information to see whether that closure was significant or how much it may have impacted your business. That's the general introduction. Looking at the next tab is expenditure. You've got 2 routes here. You can decide to fill in the data for just the period April 21 to March 22, and that's on an annualized basis. And if you choose to, you can also provide uplift for April if there's been a significant change. If you don't want to change that data, you can say no, and the April data will disappear. Let's assume you are going to give us an update in April because we know quite a lot has changed. We might say that our residents' nurse costs in this period was £10,000 and we gave them a 5% pay rise. If we put that 5% pay rise in, you'll see the total change over here. Likewise, for our carers, we know the cost was £80,000 for the year, and we gave them a 6.6% pay rise in line with national living wage. We did the same for our carers, and we did this. Maybe we did the same for our nursing assistants as well, just for example. And it'll make the relevant changes here. These are fictitious, made-up numbers, so this is quite a large number. So do ignore it. You have the ability to do that for all your other staff. Maybe it was a 2% pay rise for everybody else. And then we've got to our reception and admin staff, our cook staff, catering staff, cleaning staff. We just put those uplifts in and it will make the change for us. Obviously, if it hasn't changed, you don't need to add anything. And you don't need to do this for every single role and resource. There are lots of little help buttons to go along. If you're not sure as to what to populate, it'll tell you what's populated. The reason this section is separate from the above is that some people will have these services as outsourced. So if we look at maintenance and gardening, you may outsource that. You may not have an in-house gardener or an in-house maintenance person. You may buy those services in. So in this illustration, we said it was a £10,000 cost last year, but those costs went up quite a lot. So from April, we're expecting that to be £11,000. You can put lots of notes in the bottom if you want to, but we do encourage you not to put too many notes in because local authorities with multiple providers won't want to look at too many notes. But if you do need to explain something and you feel it's very important to your submission, please put a note in. Looking at our supplies costs, again, there are lots of notes here telling you what to input. It says that the cost information populated in this section should be net, not gross. So your net costs are in here. You're putting your food costs, say £10,000, and if you know they've gone up, you might add some inflationary costs there to show that they're in currently at £11,000. You fill that all the way through. Again, PPE costs. Now, you're not going to necessarily know what your PPE costs are because you had some free PPE for last year. So if you said that actually I only spent £10,000 last year, but I know I'm going to spend £100,000 this year, then you may want to say it's something like, I'm going to test myself here. Oops. Have I done that right? Yeah, you might. I can't do the maths at the moment. You might put in a very significant percentage to get to the number. If you know from April onwards, it's going to be a very significant percentage. I probably should have worked that out before I started doing this demonstration. Likewise, for insurance, we know some of those, they've probably doubled, so there'll be 100% uplift. And we also know that things like our energy, and again, there's lots of little help buttons here as well if you need them, but we know our energy costs have probably doubled by maybe or more, 250% potentially. So we've got a figure here of what it would be for this year. And certainly that's on the basis of April onwards. We're not predicting what's going to happen in October or later on in the year. We're just predicting what it is currently for April. Again, if we've got any notes to add, please add those in. We move down into the care home premises costs, which gives you your fixtures and fittings. Same principle for your percentage uplifts, repairs, maintenance, furniture, etc. Again, if you've got any notes to add, please do so. Any head office related costs, if you're part of a head office function, then you may want to incorporate some costs here. So of your regional management, any HR costs or legal support costs. Now, I would suggest even if you're an independent care home, you're probably going to have some legal and marketing costs that aren't covered by maybe the care home manager. This will be where you put those external service costs in. And likewise, recruitment fees, training, vetting, they will go in here as well. And then any other costs that are not captured anywhere, please populate them and put a note in here to say what you've populated in the other cost. If you leave these blank, we just need to know whether they have been assumed elsewhere. So some smaller providers might say, well, look, we don't incur any of these costs because the home manager does those as part of their cost, in which case you'll say, yes, they're included elsewhere. What that will do is it'll give you a running total at the bottom. And again, hopefully you'll start to identify these numbers as you populated them, this being for the period 21-22, and this being for what a pro rata from April onwards would look like. Moving back up to the top, we come into return on operations, return on capital. It will ask you, first of all, if you are rented property. If you are rented, you may choose to, this is how you determine what your approach is for return on capital. So I'll come to rented in a second. You may want to populate the information as a total value, in which case you can say, well, I want to generate a return of £25,000. And for this year, it's going to be £30,000. Okay, so you're just updating it for April. Alternatively, you may say, well, we work on a markup basis, in which case we apply an 8% markup, and that will apply that percentage to your operational cost that we totaled on the previous tab. Now, if you're a rented property, return on capital won't apply to all of your costs. It will only apply to the amount of money you have invested in your business. So if you're a rented property, you want to put your rent in here, maybe £200,000 a year. Okay. If you're not a rented property, then you need to put in a property freehold valuation, and that might be £1 million a year. Okay, and that will then apply the return on capital percentage to the valuation of the property to give you a total further down. What we ask you is to confirm if it was a RICS Red Book valuation. That just means it's done to a certain standard and can be used in certain calculations. Do you wish to provide your return on capital figure as a percentage of your property valuation? Or as a value for the resident per resident week. Depending if you want to choose it as a percentage value, you can put that in there. If you prefer to provide that as a resident value, you can say, well, actually, we want to claim £85 per resident week, and actually this year from April, it went up to £90 per resident week. So that's return on operations, and return on capital. Specific property. So we do ask you some property related information to determine whether your property was a purpose-built and recently built care home, because that would assume that it was pretty efficiently run. So modern purpose-built facilities are usually run more efficiently in terms of their allocation of resources than a slightly older or an old converted property or a very old purpose-built property. A 1930s purpose-built property will not be as efficient as a modern purpose-built property. It's just helpful information. They ask for a number of en-suites, wet rooms and communal bathrooms. I think this is a slightly ambiguous set of questions, because some people will determine en-suites to be just a sink in a corner of a room. So we've got some guidance notes here to tell you how to complete these exercises, how to complete those sections. We asked roughly what the metre squareage is for each room. Again, don't worry if you can't provide that information. It's not critical. It's just helpful to know whether you'll maybe have larger rooms, maybe a more premium provider. Again, any notes if necessary. Moving on, I'm going to go a bit more quickly now. In terms of occupancy, if you remember here, we said our registered capacity was 45. Our occupancy available is only 40 because we've got 5 beds out of commission. That might be that we've got a refurbishment or we've shut a unit down, for example. It asks you to provide the beds by care type, nursing dementia, residential dementia. Now, we've included the language with dementia here because DHSC have recently clarified that enhanced can include dementia. And we believe that most providers work on a scale of dementia and non-dementia rather than enhanced and standard. We also asked you to break down the occupancy of those residents by their funding type. It may be that you've only got 8 people who are funded by continuing healthcare currently, in which case it'll show that you've got 2 empty beds. Does that make sense? Moving down into occupancy here, again, we've got our out of occupancy beds. And if you look over here, we've made a mistake. Look, we put a 10 in and other there, shows that we've got too many beds. So we can take those out and we can make that change again for any adjustment in beds for CHC. Now, this is from April 22. This is for your average period 21-22. And we recognise that April may look differently to the period 21-22 because there was a greater degree of COVID. We did have lower occupancy during that time. Here, actually, we're saying we've now got 42 beds, that are, and only 3 of them are out of commission. And this is how our beds are currently occupied. And this is how they are currently funded. Okay, you'll see the flags here to tell you whether you've got underoccupied beds. It may be that you've got block beds. If you've got block beds that are paid already at 100%, we would tell you to put them in here. If they're paid only at a partial percentage, i.e. 50% or 60%, just round the number down as best you can. Staffing hours. So this is the next one. We've got some error statements here because of the way I've filled the data in. But let's just assume you want to fill this in as one care home. Just one. You're going to complete the data for as if you're a whole care home. So you'll put in the number of staffing hours per carer type, whether that's a nurse, assistant, senior carer or carer, the amount of hours you use on an average week. And then you will also say what the resident occupancy was as of April 22 for the different care types. So in this instance, we're only doing one, we're doing a care home level, so it will be the same as the above. What I will say that if you've got multiple units, maybe a residential unit and a nursing unit, it's very helpful to provide the data at a residential level and at a nursing level. So you'll be able to split this up. You might say that actually we only had 200, sorry, it was residential. We only had 200 hours of a senior carer and 600 hours here. Oops. And likewise, this was made up of, without nursing, maybe 200 and 800, however your units are made up. This will provide you with some calculations which will then show through towards the bottom. Okay, so you're providing it at for a unit level, or if you only want to do it at home level, you do so. It'll tell me I'm changing it, and then you can report it at home level only. It's quite important from our perspective that if you have got multiple units providing different care types, that you do it at a unit level, because it means that they can start to identify at a local authority level the different fee rates they might need for residential versus residential dementia or nursing versus nursing dementia. The last key tab here is your on costs. So this will talk about your employer's national insurance. You'll know what that was from last year. When you take your March 31st submission, it will tell you what you paid on an annualised basis. You'll need to uplift that by 1.25% potentially for April. So that might be 9.25% now. Employers' pension contributions and apprenticeship levy, I think 0.5% if it applies. If it doesn't apply, you can remove that. It'll tell you what your total on cost is, which will then be applied to staff pay costs. Put in the number of days here for holiday, training, sickness, maternity, suspension pay, and any others. So that's the number of days. So it'll calculate a percentage add-on of 25% per employee. You put in the number of registered staff, okay, and then your agency staff cost per hour. So this here is your annual average pay rates, sorry, for your various staff costs. So for your nurse, you're paying £20 an hour. For your nurse associate, 10, senior carers might be 12, and your carers 10. You put in your average agency hours, so hourly rate, including your on costs for any VAT that's applied in the agency margin in here. And then you put in your average agency hours for the last 3 months ending April 22. So it may be that you had 200 nurse hours and 500 care hours for that period. That will then calculate the totals at the bottom. What that will do is bring it all through to a summary page and tell you what your cost of care is towards the bottom here. This should be a figure that you identify with. I've put fake fictitious numbers in, so don't be concerned that these are rather low. Hopefully you'll be able to identify what that number is. If not, you'll be able to go back and make some adjustments. You can provide any notes if you need to, and there is an audit trail to see what changes have been made. When you submit this information, once you've agreed it, I can submit that to the local authority. Once you've submitted it, the local authority will see it, they can review it, and they can ask you questions and send you some comments back via the tool if there are any areas that need to be challenged or they're not sure of. So that is a very quick whirlwind tour of both the home care and the care home tool. I'm going to stop sharing now and open up to Q&A, given the amount of time we have left. Is that okay?
Yeah, that was, I mean, you raced through that, but I found it really helpful, just the right speed. Just to let people know, we are recording this, so if people do want to go back, then they can do. And I'm just going to go straight on to questions. And also, I suppose I also should clarify, there are some other webinars going on by, especially for the care home one, by, is it IESO, is it?
Yes, the links I've given you on the websites. If you follow those links, you'll be able to register and you'll be sent details of the relevant sessions that are made available. And
yeah.
There is another really good demo session on the 14th, Wednesday the 14th. And when I finish talking, I'll drop that into the chat for people who want to register for it. It's a really good session if you know nothing about the process so far.
Great. And a similar question from Kirsty, how do we access the toolkit for care homes?
Okay, so the link I put in the website, in the chat, that will, if you click through there, it'll tell you how you access the tool, but I will put, I'll drop another link into the chat.
And a couple of questions on what does this apply to, which services? So just a clarification, some people have asked whether it's supported living or whether the tool can be used for living care. Are you able to just go over that again?
In terms of what the scope of these tools cover are over 65 care homes, residential nursing, and domiciliary care 18+. That's the only categories that are covered by these tools. You may find local authorities ask you for information by other means in other tools, but the two national tools for which funding is being made available, the 1.362 billion over the next 3 years, is only for over 65 older persons care in care homes and domiciliary care 18+, not supported living, and the extra care is included, but there's no requirement for you to provide extra care information.
Great, thank you. Got a question from Hannah, which I think may have been answered with as you came onto the return on investment, but she's just asking out of interest what percentage is considered appropriate for the business owner to receive. Okay. And yeah.
So in terms of return on capital, we ask you to put in the return on capital rate that you would expect. So the exercises ask you what you actually spent in the period 21-22, but for return on capital and return on operations, we want you to provide what you actually require to maintain and sustain your business, because we'll be asking local authorities to take the median as the indicator, and then to sense check it over the guidance that the Department of Health and Social Care have offered, which is for return on capital about 5.5%, referencing the King's Fund report. There's also a housing benefit process that they for one-bedroom properties that they've also put within their guidance, which generates a slightly higher number. So we will be saying to local authorities, take the median of what providers tell you, and then consider how that correlates to the King's Fund 5.5% and the housing benefit sort of percentage. That's what we're suggesting providers do. In terms of return on operation, that's the gross profit allowance. And I'll let Guy maybe come onto this when he talks through the financial side of things, but you know what you need to make as a profit for your organisation. I think the Home Care Association has talked about 4%, but it is a gross figure. And so you need to make sure that once you've deducted all of your deductions, that you're still left with a sufficient amount. I've just been on one with Cheshire East, and they had a net figure of 1.2 0.2% or 1 to 2%, which I think is very low as far as I'm concerned for a local authority. I don't know any business that wants to really remain or can remain sustainable if it's making less than a 4% net margin at the end of the day, after it's paid all of its taxes and deductions. And in order to maintain a sector that's attractive to investors, we need to make sure there's at least a 4, 5, 6% net return.
Okay, very helpful. I don't know how much time you have got, because I know you're back to back in meetings. Can I ask you a couple more questions?
I'm okay till 2 o'clock.
Okay, we won't go on that long because I know you've got Guy as well and Mick to come in. But Louise is asking, for care home groups, do head office costs need to be apportioned manually for each home?
It's entirely up to you as to how you apportion your costs. So if you apportion them on a per bed, then you will calculate them on a per bed basis. If you do them on a per home or a per staff basis, it's entirely up to you. As long as you put your costs in there as head office costs, they will be covered. But you're filling in the head office costs at a care home basis. So if your head office costs were £1 million and you've got 10 care homes, you could do a straight line £100,000 per care home, or you could do it by a number of beds per care home.
Great. And then just the last one, I think, and then I've got one more after that, is Kirsty is asking, how do we go about challenging this alongside local authorities not being willing to pay for one-to-one support, yet expecting us to provide it? So just before she's got a comment, we have had a lot of care fee contributions from local authorities dropped just at the minimum wage, just as the minimum wage went up and all living costs are going up. So it's challenging this.
It's a really good question, because the exercise collecting costs from a period in time, and we give you that little period of April to adjust that based on inflation that we know has happened. But there's a piece of work that we at the CPA, the Care Provider Alliance, I'm with Care England, but I work for the Care Provider Alliance as well, and local authorities are doing with the LGA and ADAS. We're coordinating a piece of work which will be looking at how we take this data and how we establish what real inflation looks like and what indices best match inflation going forward, so that we can present back to local authorities a consistent picture of how they should take this data and inflate it within their market sustainability plans to submit in October, to ensure that we've got a sustainable sector going forward. Now, I know that some providers will have had underfunding baked into their historic data collection period, which is why it's really important that you evidence the impact of April inflation to show that those costs have changed. Now, if you've got a difficult authority that is maybe paying a rate that is too low, that is a rate that they're paying. None of what we're asking for in this exercise is revenue related. It's all about your costs. So whatever it costs you to provide the service, in addition to the markup for return on capital and return on operations, is what you would make as a business. That is the cost of running your service. And as long as you put those costs in, we will know what the costs are. We'll do the piece of work to establish, well, how do we take that and inflate it to what it needs to be sustainable and attractive to investors coming into the sector.
That's really covered a lot of what I was going to ask, because it is a period of time, and I was just wondering whether you know how the department will take into account the inflation that's yet to come, the cost hikes that are yet to come in September, because it's a little bit worrying on the face of it that you're using historic point in time to then project for future costs, but you seem to be implying that it's the local authorities that have the ability to really put in the sustainability costs of what they need in order for providers to go forward to sustain their growth. But also they need information from us, and is there anywhere in the tool where we can say, okay, well, this is where we are at April this year, but come September we're not going to be able to pay staff this rate and maintain them, or is there any way to do that?
Sure. So what we could have done with the tool, we could develop the tools and allowed 15,000 different providers to tell us what their view of inflation was. That would be like herding cats. No disrespect to providers. I'm a former provider myself. We've all got different views on what inflation is and how we create our budgets going forward. Or we could ask 152 local authorities to consider that themselves locally, that best reflects their local market. We think that's probably the best option. However, we don't trust local authorities on their own to make those decisions without providing some guidance that we know local authorities and providers would generally agree on. So that's the piece of work we're doing, to say, we'll take what you've said about April inflation and we'll say, well, what are the best markers for inflation? Be that an index for the national living wage, be that CPI, be that a utility index, be that other pay structures, be it the NHS nurses pay award. They are probably better reference points of inflation. And if we can agree local authorities to link to those within the market sustainability plans, as they change over time, we're then saying to government, to the Department of Health and Social Care, we know that utilities have gone up by another 200%. You need to make that adjustment in your allocation to local authorities so they can then consistently pass that through to us as the providers to net out so that we don't lose out. That's the intention. It'll be a bit bumpy, but that's how I hope that we're going to kind of manage that process.
To support your effort, I know people are putting about the link. I will ask Richard to look at the link, actually. We put it in the chat in a sec. But just to finish off, in terms, would it help your intentions in that if providers do put from their point of view what they feel that they need to pay people? So they've got that data in the comments section, maybe, to support what you're trying to do in a more structured way. Because I know for some people, they continue to offer certain rates of pay, but they continue not to get the right staff or have high turnover. They in their minds have a really good vision of what people are likely to accept in terms of pay rates, hours, travel, whatever. So it might, if it's a data collection exercise and there's nowhere to put that data, would it be helpful still for providers to put their points of view in the comments?
I think any provider point of view is important. And I think it's really important that when you submit your home care response, you'll attach the spreadsheet to an email. Please put that in your email. On your care homes response, you can put some notes in, but I think if too many people put notes in, it's going to be very hard to evaluate. What we say, Sophie, is that we want providers to tell you, the associations, because the associations can then work together under the CPA to try and coordinate that and get that common voice of providers to agree it with local authorities so we can create some form of consistency. I wrote a paper last week, which is just going through, and I've got a meeting at 4 o'clock to discuss it today, whereas we really want to capture those views, and we're getting a lot of them. You know, we know that if we could uplift carer pay by 2 to 3, or care worker pay by £2 to £3 per hour per individual, that's a £6 to £7 billion cost per annum. We're not going to get that ask if we ask for it nationally, but that's where we need to be setting our stall out. That's what we need to be working towards. So absolutely, but please get all that information as much as possible pushed up to the associations and let the associations carry that forward, because it's the associations that are talking to the Department of Health and Social Care, testing what the mood of providers is.
Amazing. Thank you. That's so helpful. And if you do have a few minutes, there are some comments about a couple of the links I think that you hastily put in at the top of the talk. So if you could just double check, I think one of them is missing, defaulting a little bit. Great. Thank you so much, Richard. And sorry for keeping you much longer than we expected, but I just think everyone seems to be really appreciating this information. So very well done. Thank you.
I'll just pop an email address in the bottom as well, which is a fair cost of care email address for the Care Provider Alliance. If anyone's got further questions, feel free to use that, because we are reporting those types of questions back up to the Department of Health and Social Care. They won't be used for anything else other than capturing your email and making sure you get future cascades.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, we'll leave it there and we will go straight on to Guy. So Guy, are you able to unmute? I don't know if you're able to also share your camera, but I know you're joining us from a conference, that you're doing other bits and pieces. So thank you so much for joining us.
No, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly, yeah.
Great. Ironically, I am in the office. Unfortunately, the camera seems to be playing up, so I do apologise if I kind of dip in and dip out. So yeah, I'll keep pressing the start video button and hopefully you'll see my ugly face at some point.
No problem. We can hear you perfectly, Guy. So I think really the aim I really wanted to bring you on here is, you know, we've worked with Guy a lot at Milsted-Langdon, and we just thought it'd be nice to have somebody from an accounting perspective to give maybe some response to what Richard was saying, and any advice on how to best represent costs, and any view on the exercise in general, but also if you have any sort of accounting related queries, if people can put them in the chat to make this a really good use of Guy's time, since we have him. And I don't know if you are able to just stay on a little bit, Guy, because we have gone on a bit, but absolutely.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I've earmarked to stay till 3, so I'm more than happy to take separate conversations, or discuss afterwards. So from my perspective, that's the first time I've seen the tool. So thanks, Richard. And that's actually probably changed what I was planning to talk about. So if it kind of goes off on a tangent, I do apologize. I'm acting a little bit reactively to seeing the tool for the first time. I've kind of come today. I thought probably if I just talked about maybe some of the sort of costs that we're seeing across industry sectors, things to think about, and then some practical tips. I'm an accountant, so I deal with Excel and financial modelling a lot, and then tying that back into statutory reports. So more just kind of a general thoughts around that. So if I kind of start with the fact that, obviously I'm an accountant, I'm an auditor. I work for Milsted-Langdon, which is a regional firm in the Southwest. We are pretty much a traditional accountancy firm. We do tax, specialist tax, R&D, stamp duty, personal, corporate finance. I personally act for a number of care home providers that are privately owned, registered as charities, housing associations, and they really range from sort of standalone care providers to large groups, multi-site providers, ranging down from Cornwall all the way up to as far as Warrington. Principally, I act as an independent auditor and accountant, but for some, I do provide fully outsourced finance provisioning. So that means we do the sales ledger, purchase ledger, payroll, month-end reports. So I kind of see both levels of care home providers in all sectors. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour for the sort of detail that I see. And the other thing it's worth pointing out as well is I don't just act for care homes. So I act for a number of businesses, manufacturing, and a lot of what they are going through are similar things that you are going through. So that kind of depth of experience allows me to hopefully kind of react to some of the sort of pressures you're facing in the care home and some practical tips. So usually I would kind of go straight into the detail, but I thought based on the sort of the conversation that Richard had, I mean, it strikes me from an outsider accountant observing in, it's a relatively standalone tool in terms of timelines, which is very, very hard when you look into 23, 24, 25, given the kind of current macro geopolitical climate. We know costs are going up across, food, staffing, and that's really, really very hard to bring into a financial modeling exercise. You're being asked to effectively put in a, cost for the last year, apply a percentage increase when we know probably December, March next year, the landscape is going to look fundamentally different in probably ways we don't necessarily anticipate. So on that basis, what I thought was probably if I just talk around sort of financial modeling, how it can be tricky at the best of times and how you can hopefully build in a little bit of kind of certainty within the uncertainty, which I think hopefully would allow kind of that tick box for when you kind of then put your costs going forward to be realistic. So I guess the first practical area point to consider really is kind of be realistic with costs. And I think using those costs to then springboard to kind of look at your organizations and also can you change and do things differently? Now, Richard, I guess there's a question. I presume this is a one-off exercise. There isn't a plan to revisit this in 2-3 years. Is that correct?
It's initially a one-off exercise, but when we were helping to develop the tool, the license is, I think, for 2 years. So it could be repeated in the future if it needed to be. There is capacity to do so if needed. Yeah,
that's fine. So I think on that basis, I think if you kind of approach this tool model as an opportunity to go, right, we've got this tool, we're going to use it, and then see if you can use it to your business going forward. It strikes me as I've done a similar thing with a manufacturing company where they had to provide information, and actually going through the process allowed them to then adapt it to use it to the business going forward to do some of their cash flow modeling. So, if there's a backdrop where there will be potentially a revisit of this in the future, if you can build in the tools, the notes, etc., to go forward and use it again, it will make the process a lot easier, slicker and relevant next time, and you can learn from those mistakes and issues. I think looking at the tool going through it, I didn't see particular size. I mean, things like, for example, maternity, paternity costs, shadowing costs didn't look like they were ostensibly a part of the tool, but obviously they are very real and relevant costs, which really, as a organization, you need to bear in mind. Now, I appreciate kind of modeling, it is quite prescriptive, but the reality is there's lots of ways of considering this. So, for example, I do have some clients where they put specific staff that do training as a line on their, financial accounts as staff training. Whereas actually, if it is an element of shadowing, does that need to go into the staff cost to make it relevant and viable to your organization? I think on your talk, Richard, you talked about the fact that there was free sort of PPE last year, again, that's not likely to be there going forward. So be realistic with the cost when you use that tool. And I think once you've gone through that process, what I would suggest you do is then my next tip would be to maybe take a stand back and actually look at what is that cost of care, and does it actually relate to what is going through in the accounts? So for example, you could do that in a number of ways. You could look at your statutory accounts, and you could put your April 22 accounts and have a look, and then apply that to your current occupancy levels. So if you've done the cost of care exercise and it's coming out with a figure, well, if you know what your historic occupancy levels are like, if you times the cost by your occupancy levels, does that look relevant to the information you've been producing? If it does, great, you're probably on the right tracks and you've used the tool correctly. If you haven't, what's gone on? You know, if it's coming out and actually, if you'd applied that level of revenue to your business, you'd make a loss, something's not right. Or if it's too high, that would give you a steer on, are you doing things in a way, have you used the tool incorrectly? Or are there ways of you then using that tool to, you know, provide a better return on investment, or invest in staff, etc. So I think, yeah, my sort of tip would be just take a stand back once you've done the tool and then apply it to statutory information. What have you produced? Does it make sense? And then from that, I would then say, from an accountant, you would then probably want to look and say, does this make sense 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out? Like I said, we know, for example, you know, personally at Milsted-Langdon, we've had to put 2 lots of pay rises out. And I know a lot of my clients are having to react to the staffing crisis, which is resulting in multiple pay rises at, you know, times outside of the annual pay review. You know, again, use the tool to then look forward and say, does this make sense? Now, I think this will allow you then to have some focus as the cost of service moves forward. And again, an indication of whether you're using the tool correctly. The next thing I would say is there are some key inputs in your sector: staffing, food, disposables. On the smaller items, again, with that benchmarking in mind, there is a few things that you can do that can hopefully save you money or allow you to know that you're on the right tracks with this. So there are a lot of cost-saving agencies out there that allow you to effectively benchmark your heat, your light, your PPE. And what they can do is they will look at it, and effectively how they operate is they take a saving of anything that they manage to save in terms of costings for you, but you don't have to use them going forward. But what it does allow you to do is give you some certainty of cost and know that you're on the right track. So again, if we go back to that piece where you look and you might think our costs are, you know, our cost of care would in theory generate a huge profit or a massive loss. Again, are there parameters in the sort of P&L that are significantly impacting your organization in a way that might be adverse to others? Like I said, staff is the biggie. And I mean, like I said, from personal experience, we've seen costs go up 10%, and I can see, you know, across industries and sectors, a lot of our clients, whether it's care sector, medical, manufacturing, retail, they're all seeing massive increases. So again, tying into being realistic, I think I've read mixed service costing reports, and I think your 0.66 Mick said that, you know, 34.4% of turnover on frontline staff, which, you know, that's a reality of working on the front line. But are there ways of using any surplus or profit to reinvest to bring that number down? And, you know, the reality is, if you lose staff, well, what are you going to do? It's agency staff, or it's, you know, recruitment fees. From a practical point of view, and being the accountant, there are some nice tax efficient staff incentives you can hope to bring in, which would helpfully bring with some of that retention. You've got things like, you know, certain levels of staff entertainment. Again, it keeps staff happy. It's an investment in them. You've got cycle to work. And I know there's lots of companies now offering sort of staff corporate benefits, which can be done in a very, very tax efficient way that, you know, hopefully helps retain and attract the best staff. Again, a big investment, but spending on staff events, if they can buy into your business, whether it's, you know, care or any other organization, that really does help on the retention of staff. You know, certain elements of it are going to be deductible for tax if you're a limited company. I appreciate if you're a charity, it's slightly different. But again, I would say all these things allow you to hopefully keep your key staff. And I know, looking at this modeling exercise, I know of one organization now where, because of the demographics, they simply cannot get staff, so they're having to use agency staff. And I guess that would be my next sort of point. If you're looking at this modeling aspect, it's to maybe just take a step back. And if you're seeing a decline in the ability to attract or retain staff, and actually you are increasingly relying on agency staff, then build that into the model. If that's what you're facing going forward, that's the reality of it. And I think you have to be realistic. I think aspirationally, we'd all like to have organizations well-staffed with the people there, but that's not the reality we face. And I think as well as a business owner, I would say if there's business owners on here, I take it a step further. I think we all know that we're not operating in usual times. We haven't probably done since before COVID, rolling up the sleeves, you're putting in a lot of extra time, cost and effort that probably isn't reflective on the P&L. So again, where possible, I'd look to try and bring that into the modeling. The next point, so I'm just checking I'm not going on too long, that's fine. Taxes. I wouldn't be an accountant if I didn't mention taxes. I think just to be aware on the staff side, NI, we know there's been an increase April 2022. It's gone up 1.25%. I'm not aware there's any changes coming on the horizons, but obviously we know after the Boris Johnson's vote of confidence, there's talk about tax savings. How they're going to manifest, we don't know. But for now, I think you can reasonably expect as a employer, a 1.25% increase staying on your national insurance. So again, that's a cost that you need to build in. On the corporation tax side, if there are limited companies, I'll cover it just if there are business owners here. We've talked about the return of investment and the return on operations. The reality is surplus and profit isn't a bad thing. It allows for reinvestment in staff, IT. Obviously, the reality is if you're successful and you make money and you're a limited company, you are going to pay tax. And just to be aware that the corporation tax rates historically have been 19% for the last few years. They are moving to 25%. Again, tying it with financial modeling, very often, business owners will look at the cash in the business and assume that's the profit. Well, there are taxes to pay. And again, that's a very, very real expense that needs to be paid. And again, if you're looking at that cash flow modeling, thinking about where staff costs are going, food costs, disposables, again, if you can turn this exercise of looking at the cost of care into something that allows you to provide strategic planning going forward, you can build in things like corporation tax planning. So you're not going to get blindsided by a particular tax bill. It allows you to factor that into what is the real cost of the business going forward and being able to properly operate. The final point I was going to raise was about speaking to professionals and challenging the model. So you talked about that fee gap. I think this is genuinely not our sales pitch, but at its heart, regardless of kind of the agenda of this care service consideration and the fee gap, etc., it is a modeling exercise. And I would encourage that once you've done this, that you take a step back and engage with either someone in your organization that's switched into the business and financially savvy, whether it's an accountant or a non-exec director or someone, to sit back and look at it with a fresh pair of eyes and challenge it and get used to the model. I think the toolkit looks good. I think understanding how that then relates to your business and whether it's relevant is going to be hugely, hugely important. I think if you take it back to kind of a statutory accounts level, the balance sheet of your organization is a point in time. And that's very much what that toolkit represents. It's a point in time. The reality is beyond that, everything in terms of the P&L and the mapping is effectively a viewpoint. Apart, turnover goes into revenue, but how you map those costs is really, really important. And again, it allows you with that stand back approach to just really challenge the model and challenge your model going forward as a business. I mean, the example most recent, really, I appreciate it's not the same as this, but a number of businesses through COVID applied for the job retention, applied for civils. We had some clients that went for upwards of 2 million. Again, that interpretation of the data as you applied it, looking at the modeling and looking at three-way forecasts. What does the P&L look like if we can't find staff and we use agency? What if we can find the staff? What if we don't have to put up pay rises? These things will allow you to effectively model where you think the business is going forward. So when you plug in that cost of care, you can then really look back and say, is it relevant? Is it right? And is it fit for purpose over the next 2-3 years? Now, like I said, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to speak to your accountant. It could be, anyone internally that can act as that critical friend, almost a kind of a firm sounding board to make sure that the exercise is with sound logic. And on that note, I would say, I know there's that note section. Anything that you do, I would suggest you just keep those notes, the logic behind it, because we can all on a bad day think the world is falling in. Staff costs are going up 15%. You put 15. Take a step back. Going back to this exercise, if you are going to use it as an opportunity going forward, or if you have to approach it again in 3 years' time, for example, being able to look at it with the logic, understand where your thoughts and feelings were at that point in time, so then you can make the historic time with the recent and relevant is hugely important. And that's really the points that I had, Sophie. I'm conscious of time as well.
Yeah,
hopefully
that was incredible, real canter through. I made a lot of notes myself. I do definitely encourage people, if they have any thoughts, just to pop them in the chat. However, basic you may think they might be, it doesn't really matter. We've got some really fantastic specialists on the call here, so just use their time. I thought it was really helpful, the consideration of agency staff as well, because I think that's been a huge cost. But presumably, if people are doing this properly, they will look at their costs and then factor those in. I absolutely think that you should approach this, from reflecting on what you said, as forget about the tool for a minute. Just go away and look at your costs, because I think looking at the tool first will almost make you forget what your costs are. And the way that you mentioned about maternity and paternity, of shadowing, of the different ways that training is built into what we need to provide. So if you're paying for someone to do training, you're also paying for the backfill of staff to work while that person is providing training. Another thing that you mentioned, which made me think, is the factoring it into your staff costs of your managers. For example, if you've got managers who are actually having to go onto the shop floor in order to cover absences of staff, they're still being paid their manager's rate. So there's no point actually accounting for that as staff time, at frontline staff rate. It needs to be accounted for at a manager's rate. Similarly, if providers are then doing a lot more, then I suppose presumably supporting the manager's role, that cost will be needed to be considered at the provider level, their hourly cost as a provider, not as a manager or as a member of care staff, and all of the other associated costs. And I noticed they've lumped together finance, HR, marketing, etc. And there's a lot of etc. in there. So I think, again, it's about not looking at the tool first, almost looking at your cost first, maybe doing a week in the life of us as an organization and just jotting down what are we doing and what we're paying for, and then going back and seeing what are our costs and how do these fit into the tool. Because I feel like the way the tool is really simplified, maybe to make it accessible, but there is a chance that you might, in the rush to complete it, actually leave out some of your costs, not intentionally, but just because you just want to get it in, you've got a lot of things on your plate, but actually it's a real danger that we underrepresent our costs because we've just not had enough time to think through it, and the tool doesn't necessarily break it down to every single line because everyone's got different costs. So I think that push for people to be reflective is really, really helpful. And I think that was my reflections on what you were saying. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add, or did anyone else want to come in? I have not seen any questions. People are probably mulling it over, but
I was going to say one thing, if that was okay. That was really helpful for me, actually. I've deferred my next meeting because I wanted to hear what you had to say. I think the point you made at the end around saving those notes and comments that you make as you're filling it in, so if it is repeated in a couple of years' time, is really sensible. And I'm certainly going to add that into my narrative when I talk to people about this, because I think I'm guilty of making that mistake myself. But I did want to say that providers for the care home tool, you can export your exercise afterwards and hold that as a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet, so you can retain that information for the future. I think that's a really good piece of advice.
Oh, brilliant. That's really good news, actually, because I wasn't sure of that myself. So 100% we should do that. Yes. So Louise put in there, we should probably charge, actually. We can't because it's gone past April. But, how much time this is going to take, Louise is saying.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because there are rumbles with some authorities. They can't. Care England tends to represent some of the larger providers, And what we've agreed is that we're not going to charge larger providers are not going to charge for filling out these exercises, because they've got corporate functions with accountants who sit there on a day-to-day basis actually doing this work. But for smaller providers don't have those resources. A care home manager is the HR person, is the manager of the care home, is the marketing person, does absolutely everything. They don't have the time necessarily, so they probably are going to incur some cost by going to the local accountants. Now, what we have said is that if it is going to be a burden for you, you need to approach local authorities and say, look, it's going to cost me £1,000. Are you able to help for that? Because they've got a share of £162 million this year. That's just under £1 million, just around about £1 million per 150, each of the 152 authorities. They can use up to 25% of that to fund the operationalisation of this exercise. So in the first year, they've got a couple of £100,000 they can each play with to do this. I mean, they are going to have to recruit people, they're going to have to retain people, they're going to have to use third parties. But if there are a few of you who are going to struggle, ask the council. They can only say no. Please don't let that be a barrier for participating. And one thing I think is really important to say is, if you can't provide a full submission, at least provide a partial one. Provide as much as you can, because if enough people provide a full response, then at least those that provide a partial response, their data will be able to use to validate some of the data that's already in the system, or what's in the system already will be able to validate and fill some of the gaps where there is missing information. What we desperately need is a representative sample of small independent care providers, medium groups and large groups that represent the whole. We don't want just larger groups providing, we don't want just smaller, because they've got very different cost bases. We need that blend and we need that mix, because the median number is the fair cost of care that they will get to. It's one number for the fair cost of care, and then the local authority will probably have 20 different rates that they pay providers to get to that. And you will be paid based on what you provided to get towards that fair cost of care rate. It's very important you provide as much information as possible.
So, and when you say you, it's all of you. They're not taking a provider by, like in the past, they normally approach every single provider individually, and then they try and match it as a group in the area.
The fair cost of care will be the local authority's fair cost of care rate, which will be reflective of the median it pays for the fair cost of care. It may have 1,000 different rates it pays every different individual provider. As long as the aggregate of those is moving towards that median, then they'll get a thumbs up from DH. But it doesn't mean that they're automatically just going to pay every provider the fair cost of care. They will still pay some people above it, some people below it, some people exactly that rate. But depending on what information you provide will probably determine where you sit on that scale. You'll either be paid at, above, below, or at the rate. So it's important that they know where your costs are, so they know what to pay you going forwards.
That's why it's just so important to get this right. So thank you all so very, very much.
Is it likely to be weighted based on the size of organisation?
I don't think
on the basis, obviously, if you're looking at, say, an acceptable rate of return is 4%, 4% for a big multinational care home provider making, £1 million is 4% is going to be far higher than a small operator maybe working on a smaller profit margin.
Yeah, it won't be, the outcome won't be weighted based on size, but it will be weighted based on information relevant to the local market. So if the local market suggests there is an oversupply of residential care, then there will be less pressure for them to fund residential care. There'll be more pressure for them to fund the care that they need to fund, which will be in domiciliary care, or it could be nursing care when domiciliary care is exhausted and they move past residential into nursing care. But it'll be weighted based on lots of different factors, but what it actually costs to provide that care and what it can buy care for. Now, if there is an undersupply in the market and there are only beds available at £1,500 per bed, that is what they have to pay. Because that is the cost the market has led them to believe is the cost.
Good question here from Louise. Can I assume that they can't use the data against us? I remember a previous cost consultation and they started arguing with care homes that their costs for an area were too high, etc. I think this is echoing experience of a lot of providers. I think that's one for you, Richard.
It's really bad practice for local authorities to do that. But yeah, some local authorities are going to do that. I do know North Somerset. I do know Baines. I know some of the personalities at some of these authorities, and I know some of them have in the past used tactics that I don't potentially agree with. But your costs are your costs. There's no failure, there's only feedback. If you get feedback to say, look, your group head office costs are completely out of kilter of the whole sector. You as an organisation, taking what Guy said before, need to think about that. Well, actually, what can I do? Because if I'm not competitive because of my structure or the way that I do certain things, then that's something to consider. If my food costs are twice the price of somebody else's, I need to think that maybe I need to look at my food supplier. You know, so I think some information is really good feedback, but I do totally recognise exactly where that comment's coming from, because I've seen some really unacceptable behaviour of local authorities in the past. All I'd say is use your care association in that respect, and then we will work with all care associations to support the associations to make sure we take whatever action we can against authorities who embrace that bad behaviour.
I think it would be very interesting to find out how the department and the government use this data, because I think those type of challenges which Louise is talking about might now come from a more central position where people are saying, well, now we've taken all of the costs from all of the sector, and now this is, so, you know, even though there is naturally a variation on, you know, who wants to offer people home cooked stuff and who wants to offer people like basically frozen meals all the time, and a lot of providers were like, we want to stick at the quality of our care, and we've got a CQC rating. So I think if you just need to just represent what your costs are at the way that you want to provide your care and stick to it, because the government is quite clear that it's a negotiation. So no local authority should be able to say, well, this is what you should do. It's a negotiation, it's two-way. So definitely be very firm on that. It's in the guidance from the department, and you can be confident that you can really do that and carry on providing the quality of care that you feel that is necessary for you. Just a general comment, I am very, very worried that it is a point in time, and I think that it makes this a very difficult exercise. I know Mick is going to discuss this a bit more, so I'm super excited to bring him in. We've gone very much over time, but I think it's been necessary and people have hung on, so I think that they found it useful. So I think that, I mean, thank you so much, Guy and Richard. You're welcome to stay on for Mick's part if you'd like to, but otherwise I will say thank you and bye to you. And I have popped in information for Guy, Milsted-Langdon. I hope you don't mind, just in case people wanted to follow up with you and your services in any way. And Richard, thank you for your links as well. So we'll say thank you to you and move on to Mick.
Hi there. Thank you for that, and for your introduction, Sophie. I'd like to be able to share my slides. If Toby, are you able to make that possible?
You should have the capacity to do that, Mick. If you don't,
okay, share screen. I got it. I think I just
you got it. Excellent.
Okay, let's have a look. Okay.
Excellent. Yeah, I can
see
that
with
now.
Me. Just. Okay, people see that?
Yeah.
Good. All right. Okay, so I'll just sort of briefly introduce myself. So, I mean, I have sort of two hats. I've worked for a care association for Care and Support West for, I think it's 13 years, coming up, something like that. And for the last 10 years of that, pretty much, I've done their annual cost pressures report. I also have a job and work for a learning disability provider. So I do that as a sort of, I guess, my sort of main job. So, and I've done that for a similar length of time. So I've got a sort of day-to-day experience of actually how to costing out services. Before that, I worked for larger organizations and had some sense of that. Developed sort of service costing frameworks with myself, trying to sort of approach costs from a bottom-up perspective. So I'm just sort of sharing with you some thoughts around it. Sort of Richard talked about the sort of the mood of providers. Well, I'm sharing with you my mood, if you like, as a provider in relation to social care. And actually what we were told was going to happen is we were going to fix social care. Okay, this man stood on those steps and he said, I'm announcing now on the steps of Downing Street that we will fix the crisis in social care once and for all. Okay, so actually I'm not interested in anything other than that happening. That's what, it's a nice soundbite, but that's where I'm coming from. And I think we as providers, I see that as a gift. Actually, that statement is a gift to us as a sector if we use it and if we hold people him properly account and those around him properly to account for it. So that informs my thinking. So I am thinking of the tool, but this thinking hasn't come from the tool. It's come from, okay, we need to fix social care. How are we going to do that? So it was mentioned by Guy briefly. I sort of did some musings and put together a sort of a service costings consideration report quite recently. And this, in effect, what I'm going to go through now is sort of the executive summary of that. It's available if people are interested in it on the Care and Sport West website. You can download it from there. So sort of starting point. So we've got dramatic increases in the cost of living. We've got an increasingly desperate staffing situation, I would argue. And social care, we're not going to fix social care if any recalibration exercise is going to use historic costs to establish future rates. To my mind, are very clear about that. And so we are talking about a fixed point in time. I do see that within the tool, there are mechanisms for, some sort of future projection. Part of the whole picture is annual uplifts as well, because I think at one point in time could work as long as annual uplifts that follow that capture everything else effectively. And to date, I don't believe they do. The median, and I understand why people are using a median. I found the definition, the value lying at the midpoint of a frequency of distribution. That's fine. But my concern with that, and I don't have an answer to this, is that if you use median rates, that by definition, you're going to have a whole bunch of people who are above that rate. So it's sort of, there's a rationale, there's a method for why you do it. But actually, I don't know that always when your rates are above that, there's an illegitimate reason for them being so. I was speaking to a provider yesterday at a conference, and they were talking about management structures, for example, and staffing ratios to managers. And actually one provider that was sort of privately funded had upped their, so basically they had less staff per manager. So, so that cost came out a lot higher. So they were an outlier, but they were an outlier because because of good practice, not because they were, sort of doing something wrong. They were actually trying to put something right. And that's what made them an outlier. I think, fixing social care, we are not going to fix social care unless we address the fundamental issue of staff pay. I'm 100% clear of that in my head. Not only are social care staff significantly undervalued for the work that they do, but also those low rates of pay combined with the cost of living crisis means that more and more frontline staff are just not going to be able to afford to work in social care. So in this exercise, if we are going to do this exercise, we're going to get this exercise right, it is going to have to address the issue of staff pay, to my mind. I just wanted to flag up sort of unfair to care, a report that came out, I think July last year, which I thought really useful. What I liked about it is somebody bothered to look at the skill set of social care workers and can compare and contrast them to other sectors. It's got a relatively straightforward thing to do. It's the first time I've ever seen it. And what they found is that frontline support workers would be paid nearly £7,000 more a year if they held equivalent positions within the NHS, local authorities and other public funded industries. Okay, so that I thought was, that's sort of useful for us to know. I think that's a useful sort of piece of information. And if you sort of work that out, Richard was talking about sort of extra money, and that's sort of the niceness of being able to pay our frontline staff another sort of £2 to £3 an hour. Their rate works out at a mid-scale point for a frontline staff worker of £12.61 an hour. And that's a rise of just over 32%, almost 33% on the current national minimum wage. Even Ayres, they recognise the need for a social care premium, and they, in their, I think the submission, last September submission, advocating a starting point of £11.50 for social care workers. Yeah, and I just think if we're not able as a sector to pay a premium, as we did historically, for working in the sector, we're going to lose staff too and not be able to attract staff from other sectors. And we've already got a very, very, very difficult staffing situation going on. As part of this year's sort of cost pressures report, which came out sort of January time, so it's a different document, again available by through our website. We're talking about integration of greater cooperation, greater integration of health and social care. Nobody's arguing with the principle of that, but there is a bit of, well, put your money where your mouth is going on for me. And what I tried to do is I looked at the current NH, or the 2021-22 NHS pay scales, and then I looked at social care. What would you do? How could you have a similar type of pay scale for social care? So actually we're valuing people properly and on a par with NHS staff for the work that they do. And I'm not saying this is, absolute or complete, but it's and there are issues for the NHS staff who are then, go off to college and are qualified through that route. But it's a starting point to try and sort of, further the conversation, shape a narrative around actually what are social care staff actually worth, and how should they be rewarded? How long are we going to continue to just be unfair to care? So basic rates of pay. So in all of this, so I put here sufficiently above the national minimum wage. This is in terms of pay structures. So premiums for working antisocial hours, working split shifts or lone working, supporting or caring for people with complex needs, experience and or length of service, taking on greater levels of responsibility. So these are all sort of, additional aspects of the role, or things that you bring to the role, requirements of you. And they're not for a laugh. You don't put these things are, they're higher asks, they're greater asks of your care worker, working weekends, bank holidays, all hours, waking nights, working on their own, working split shifts, all of these things, working with highly complex people. Yeah, they need to be incentivized. If we're going to have a social care sector that's fit for purpose, where we have a workforce that can deliver what our society needs, then we're going to have to incentivize these types of requirements. Improving employee benefits. In my report, I'm arguing that actually, there's a lot of social care staff they're underpaid, but also they're overworked. They have to work extra because they have to pick up the overtime to make ends meet, all of those sorts of things. And then so they're doing more and they don't have the recovery time they need. So they're sort of done a disservice, if you like, I think, by sort of current levels or statutory levels of holiday pay. And I think, like in other sectors, they, certainly for people who've been in the sector for a long time, people who are in more senior or demanding roles, then the amount of time off that they have should reflect those commitments. I put better support for staff sickness, particularly when it's long term. A lot of the sector's, I think, a bit mixed really in terms of its sickness provision. I know some do try. That does happen. I think some do little of anything more than the statutory minimum because often they can't afford to. And I think the situation where you've got somebody who has a long-term illness, and all the sort of the problems that brings with them, for them to actually just be expected to exist on statutory sick pay, given what they're giving to the sector and society, is, to my mind, is abhorrent. Actually, and I think we need to have a far better, in this fixing social care, fair to care, a far better reflection of the value of in some ways of human life, actually, in the way we treat our staff, or the way our staff are treated, because the treatment actually isn't often by us. We talked about, didn't we, staff well-being. We're talking about that. We went outside and we clapped for our staff. And then it was sort of back to business as usual. But, I think things like occupational health, employee assistance programs, they need to be cost lines. They need to be in there as standards. They should not be nice to have if you can afford it. So on costs, so just on a little bit about on costs, I think Guy touched a bit on them. So to my mind, there's no sort of hard and fast, on costs are calculated in different ways and there's no hard and fast approach, but these are the sorts of things, some of which Guy mentioned, that I would want covered. or should be covered, should be considered. Employees' national insurance contribution generally sits in there nicely. Paid holiday, maybe more paid holiday. Sick pay and maternity pay. Again, the statutory minimums are just not adequate. Health and wellbeing support services. Suspension pay. Time to attend training. Employees' pension contribution. I did a little bit around non-contact time. So what I worked out, or my sort of calculation, activities like record keeping, staff handovers, team meetings, supervisions, you know, to do those properly, you're probably talking around 4.5 hours a week. So, you know, in that order, that's what I calculated, and sort of that was looking at it not from afar, but actually as a provider. Those are what are sort of, you know, a bit of a time and motion on that. So on a 37.5 hour week, that's 12%. You know, you see, well, we put in 10%. Well, 10% isn't enough, would be my view. And also shadowing time for new staff, and recognizing that the higher your staff turnover, the more shadowing time you're going to require. Yeah, being a registered manager, I don't think it was ever a breeze, was it? But I think, you know, it's become an increasingly demanding and professional role. Skills for Care, their sort of sector report is showing a turnover around about just over 20, almost 21%. You know, 15% is a national average turnover for staff across all sectors. For managers, you'd expect that to be slightly less. I don't have a figure for it, but, you know, maybe 12%, something like that. So it's significant, isn't it? That's a cause of concern for us as a sector. And I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday, just sort of musing about some of this. This was my recollection prior to that conversation. So since CQC came in, I was going between quarter and a third. The workload for registered managers has increased in that order. And without saying a quarter and a third, the other person just came in third. They're a registered manager, and that was their sense. You know, it's a tall order. It's a tough task at times being a registered manager, and I don't think it's properly. You know, it's just more and more and more and more stuff is just thrown on the registered manager, and they're expected to just to absorb it. Well, actually, I think it's time, if we're going to be fixed social care and keep our registered managers, value our registered managers, grow our registered managers, have a, you know, all of that sort of stuff, then maybe we need to recalibrate how much time is a reasonable amount of time for, you know, for a manager's working week, and how many managers you need to do the job. The other thing, as part of this, there's always been a standard management charge, which I find quite amusing, because management is very seldom standard in my experience, and the more complex the client's needs are, or their support needs, the more challenging the behaviour is. At times, the more complex and challenging the behaviour of their relatives is, the more management time a care package can require, and yet you're just given a set amount which doesn't reflect, you know, the complexities of the situations that you as a manager face. So annual uplifts. So yes, we can have our point in time. We are going to have our point in time. Let's go with it. Let's do that. But actually, I don't think in my experience over the last 10 years, looking at this on an annual basis, the current annual uplift mechanisms across the regions where I work are just not fit for purpose. And I've put it to be effective. I believe these mechanisms, they need to maintain a viable differential between social care and other competitive sectors, so maybe retail, hospitality. So we've got to maintain, they would have to maintain a social care premium. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but be based on a basket of goods and services that better reflect providers' actual cost areas. I think actually we know what our costs are. We're being asked to put our costs in. It's not like that information, you know, there are frameworks. This whole tool is a structure for us apportioning costs. So we know what types of costs that we have. And so I do think we could get a better basket. I don't think it would be that difficult. And I think annual uplifts need to be applied consistently, because We've been through years where, you know, sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't. And certainly at the beginning of austerity, I mean, there were several years, I think, when the annual uplifts just went out the window. I just saw that CPI or RPI, I mean, it was RPI in our annual uplift formula, it was RPI. The government changed CPI, as I understand it, because it's a lower rate in order to calculate.
Sorry, Mick, can you just explain what those both are?
Yes, consumer price index or retail price index. So they are used within formula for annual uplifts to basically to calculate a proportion of the annual uplift. And when I've spoken with my own experience in life, our own experience in life is, I think when we see these indices, we go, well, my inflation's more than that. You know, my costs have gone up more than that. And I think certainly when talking to providers, they go, well, that doesn't reflect my actual increase in costs. So I mean, they're quite sophisticated in their makeup as baskets of costs, but they're not reflective of our costs as a sector, I would argue. And actually, it isn't just me arguing. I think when I speak to providers year on year, they say, well, actually, that's rubbish. You know, my costs have gone up so much more than that. Yeah, so I think neither of them actually reflect inflation as we experience it as providers. So I think this is in the new document. So we do have a whole range of costs that we know what they are. And this list goes on, but there's you will recognise, I would imagine, pretty much every cost line on this. And then we can have it for 1 year, and then we can have it for the next year. It's quite easy to plot it out, and then you can just calculate the percentage change. So very easily, year on year, for key cost areas, there could be a mechanism which identifies the percentage change as it would be experienced by a provider across key cost areas. And I don't see that that's, well, I would say is where there's a will, there's a way. Continuous improvement. So what's happened, as I understand it, or as I experience it, is quality assurance. We want a lot more quality assurance. CQC want a lot more quality assurance. We expect a lot more quality assurance from you. Data now, it's sort of data security. We expect a lot more of that. Your standards need to rise. And IT systems, a whole load of stuff that are effectively requirements of a service. And my view is, if it's a requirement of a service, if you require us to do it, it's a cost line, and it needs to go in as a cost line. All right, this is not something that I should be expected to then provide out of my profit margin, which is already being, overly squeezed and viewed as a black hole. Because in that situation, I'm only going to be able to do it if I can afford to do it. Yeah, and actually, you're expecting me and requiring me to do it. Maintenance, I'm saying in terms of this. So again, it's a CQC requirement to maintain your properties. This is all for property-related services to an adequate standard. Many properties are subject to unusually high levels of wear and tear. And whilst I do recognise there are, there's ways that they calculate the amount that they include within a bed price, if you like. My reflection and experience is that the amount that we get is not enough for the maintenance cost that we have to pay. And what happens then is either work that you should do this year, you go, well, actually, I'll bump that over to next year. Or, if it's urgent, you're having to take it out of your bottom line. So, but again, it's a requirement. Empty beds. So voids, we've been through an extremely difficult and I think atypical, I think we'd all agree, atypical time with the pandemic. I think prior to that, and hopefully after the sort of full recovery post that, there needs to be, if you've got too high void levels or too low occupancy, that's going to destabilize your service and make it unsustainable. So you're probably building in something around about 7.5–10%, I would argue, to help mitigate against that risk. I will mention this point, but voids, the concept of voids for learning disability services, it doesn't seem to exist in the same way as it does for older people's residential services. And just my reflection on that is, whilst we don't lose clients with the same level of frequency, when we do, replacing a client, getting the right fit in a small home can actually take months and months and months, you know, sometimes longer than that. So, and yet there's no contingency within a learning disability bed price for voids. So I think that's something to think about. There was some mention of extra special needs payments. So the way I'm defining that, if a client has needs that cannot be adequately met by the core staffing profile without compromising service ability to meet other clients' needs, okay, then the needs basically, if you can't meet people's needs without compromising other people's needs, because that's what happens in reality, is that somebody requires more of your time and therefore somebody else gets less of your time. And where that's the situation, everybody is deserving of your time to the degree that their needs reflect. And therefore, in order to maintain that, if somebody is pulling more of your time or your staff's time, then that needs to be reflected in an extra special needs payment. Okay, I mean, this is a profit or surplus, and I'll own this stuff. This was quite a difficult one to sort of work out. The first thing I want to say, it's not a dirty word. And actually it's the lifeblood of social care provision in this country. No profit, no surplus, no service. And also inadequate levels of return, no incentive for investment. And I've seen, you know, loads of different figures. I've seen, you know, I mean, there's figures, I mean, 8% is muted for us. I've seen 12%, I've seen 6%, 4%. And I know what I'm prepared to get out of bed for, and it's not 4%. And I don't know that actually that is viable, particularly if it's perpetually under pressure. So if we want and need a social care sector, there needs to be a climate to support investment. So broadly, for me, key factors driving profit margins are the level of investment needed. The higher the investment, the greater the expected return. The amount of time and effort that people put in. The more demanding it is, the greater the reward people expect for their endeavours. And the level of risk associated with the venture. So the riskier it is, the higher the level of return expected. So, and in all of this, it's not, you know, I can aspire to a profit margin, and all organisations, you know, have a line where they put a profit, an expected return, if you like, but actually what I expect is not what's important. What I achieve is what's important. That's what's going to keep my business going. That's what's going to keep the sector afloat. So I mean, this is a slight aside, but just the sort of time and time again, we've had the sort of, well, you know, we've got to pay you as little as we possibly can because it all comes from the public purse. And I think that's I think that's applied in a dangerous way. The public purse, as I see it, is there to fund societal infrastructure. Now, there is a clear case for doing that in a cost-effective manner. There's no argument from me there. But what has happened and what I see happening is it's a systematic and brutal mechanism to underfund social care infrastructure. And I think at times, and for some, to the very edge of their existence. And I would argue that that is not a good use of public money. So reasonable profit margin. Okay, so again, I don't want to get out of bed for 4%. Sorry. So it's hard to give it, you know, there's, as I say, there's so many different variables out there. And I think, you know, it's something where I'm the reason to sort of, okay, that's the figure, put it in. But my argument and my view is, if we're going to fix social care, because that's what we're trying to do, that's why we're having these conversations to fix it, investment needs to be, it needs to be worth investing. So we're talking about achieved return. Now, I think, you know, I would get out of bed for 10%. I would do that. If I could achieve that, I think that would incentivize the sector, that would incentivize me. But that would be after tax. So if you're calculating, if you're looking at your net and your gross, then, you know, in order to achieve that profit margin, you're going to have to build in, you know, some factor for your corporation tax. And if you're looking to provide, specialist service, highly specialist services, high quality services, a lot of sort of, top end provision, or ventures with more inherent risk, I would argue then that you might be, I'm picking the figure, but you're going to be looking, the principle is you're looking for a higher return as a consequence of doing those things. And what we do is we have these expected or aspirational profit margins, and which are squeezed anyway because we're told what a lower level is acceptable. And then what happens is that, oh well, we're not going to, the annual uplifts, well, we're not going to pay you for all the national minimum wage increase, and you can swallow the national insurance uplift, and energy prices, well, we'll give you whatever it is, and they're going to cost you an awful lot more. Insurance, there's lots of things that you're just, as a provider, just expected to absorb, and that's your quality assurance as well, and that's your data security, all these things. You're just meant to, that somehow your limited profit margin is expected just to take all these things in and suck them all in. So if that's the case, if that's the culture and the climate that we're operating in, then there needs to be a buffer built in. If that's how it needs to be played, then on top of your 12 or 13%, maybe you need to put in some more in. So maybe you need to be looking at 14 or 16%. And if it's a higher quality, if you're looking for a 15% return and you're expected to absorb everything, then maybe you're putting in a higher still, so closer to the 20%. So the social care marketplace, I think we're teetering. That's where I feel we are. I think we're teetering. I think some unfortunately have teetered. And given the situation at the moment, I mean, it's a sort of a really, what I'm struck by is just the cost of it, how desperate the situation is, how the cost of living is just gone ballistic. And we're sort of on that knife edge, and yet we've got that 39 billion from coming in from the national insurance and the health and social care levy going to the NHS. That as I understood it, the promise was to fix social care, but social care is getting a minuscule amount of that at a time it critically needs it, and that's spread over 3 years. And the timing of this is sort of, it's not going to take much to send more and more providers over the edge if we don't fix social care. And if that happens, it's going to take years, if ever, to recover. It's not like it can just ping back up again. Yes, there'll be a catastrophic shortfall between supply and demand, and I think the implications of that, I think we've not even really sort of begun to recognise. Not convinced that those in power properly understand the extent of the problem and how imperative it is to find a long-term solution. In all of it, I don't see, this is a bit like shuffling the deck chairs around on the Titanic, to my mind. It's fixable. It is fixable, but you're going to have to invest in it.
Mick, I'm just conscious of time. It sounds like you're coming to the end, but just
the last slide.
Wrap up. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fine. And I would say it's down to the sector, to shape the narrative. We're used to having the narrative shaped, being told what to do. And I think that needs to change. We are the experts. We know what it costs. We know, what is required to deliver good quality social care. And we need to educate those around us in relation to what that is. I'm done. Thank you. So yeah, sorry for that. Well, not sorry for that, but that is my mood, and those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much. I feel like we all should give you a virtual round of applause because I know this is a session that's based on the cost of care exercise, but I think just having a wider perspective in terms of policy and where this fits in the whole political debate around social care is just so helpful, and also to help us realise how important this exercise is, no matter how we might criticise it for having its massive limitations. And I personally am extremely worried about it. I think we still need to participate, and we definitely need to put in the costs, as as you've laid out, really represent those costs for what they really need to be. So I haven't really got any questions. I mean, everybody's I love your slides. They're really dynamic. Are you happy? Sorry to put you on the spot. Are you happy to share those slides or send us the version?
That's fine. Absolutely, I will. And the costing report is available. I mean, yeah, this is a summary of, but there's a bit more detail in the service costings considerations document as well.
Great. I've put a link to all of that, and we'll share these links to anyone who signed up on the Eventbrite as well. And Rizwan's just making the comment that historically EBITDA used to hover around 30%. So why would we not base our profit requirement to the base around this number?
Yeah. And there you got, I mean, it's all calculated in different ways, but there you got, you know, another figure. And I've heard, you know, and then you got 4%. I mean, how do you square those two things? So I'm just trying to build it from the bottom. What at the end of the day, when everything's stripped out and I've actually achieved it, what would I get out of bed for? Well, not me, but what should we as a sector get out of bed for?
And I think it's really helpful for you to position it in terms of we have a chance to shape the narrative. I actually think it is really limited in the way we're able to shape the narrative in this costing exercise for the reasons we've explained before. But maybe in the return, that is where we need to put
right all over it.
we know that maybe that's where we need to say, okay, well, you haven't given us lines where we can put in our future costs or what we think we need, but the return is a way of reflecting what the investment we'll need to make in the next year for the data protection, for increases in wages and investment in properties and doing things up like we want to, which we weren't able to because of the pandemic and restriction on visitors and servicemen and whatever. So maybe that is the way that we bump up, because, you know, I'm conscious that we are of a culture which has been represented in the chat, where we have been encouraged to represent a lesser cost or trying to keep our costs down. And I think if we are still living off of that culture that we've been encouraged to pursue, then we might do ourselves a disservice, because they're looking at this medium, which I'm really don't think is very helpful at all, this median, this midpoint on all the ranges of costs. And the more people that say we're costing less, then it's the less that we'll all get. And then the opportunity cost of that is then they will base it on those costs and say, well, this is what you gave us, so this is what you get. And then we'll all be out of business, because we can't reasonably expect staff to live off nothing. So I think we have to find ways of really helping to support our sustainability as a sector, and maybe it is in the return bit that we put that, because of the restrictions on representing our true costs, which is really, really tricky, because they've gone, and, you know, a lot of the costs coming down the line are from April onwards, you know. So that's the thoughts.